On the 14th of October, 1942, two things happened involving Errol Flynn. The first thing happened in a courtroom in Los Angeles. A grand jury was convened to consider charges against Errol Flynn related to the alleged statutory rape of two young women, one of whom was 17 years old and one of whom was 15. The grand jury deliberated. The charges were referred to trial. Errol Flynn, who was 33 years old and who was at this point the most popular male film star in the world, would spend the next several months in a criminal trial that produced the specific combination of public spectacle and private devastation that the American legal system reserves for its most celebrated defendants. The second thing happened that same evening in a restaurant in Beverly Hills. Errol Flynn sat down to dinner with a writer named Niven Bush and a director named Raoul Walsh and two other men, whose names the subsequent accounts of the evening have not preserved. The men ate and drank, and Flynn was, by the account of both Bush and Walsh in their respective memoirs, the most charming man at the table. He was funny. He was warm. He was full of opinions and energy and the specific quality of engagement with the people around him that made everyone in his company feel, for the duration of his attention, like the most interesting person in the room. He did not mention the grand jury. He did not mention the charges. He ate his dinner and told his stories and made the table laugh and went home. Two men, the same person, the same October evening in 1942. Tonight, my friend, I want to introduce you to both of them. Not the one that Hollywood presented and that America consumed across 20 years of adventure films. The swashbuckler, the Captain Blood, the Robin Hood, the man who seemed to exist in a permanent state of effortless, photogenic joy. Not only that man, the other one. The one that the adventure films were partly constructed to conceal, and partly constructed to express, and partly constructed by someone who did not always know where the concealment ended and the expression began. Because here is what I want you to understand before we go back to the beginning. The two men were not a good man and a bad man, though the moral accounting of his life has been organized around exactly that binary since before he died. They were not the public charmer and the private monster, though the trial and the behavior that the trial documented invited that reading, and the reading has been accepted without much resistance by most of the people who have written about him since. They were something more complicated and, I think, more human than either of those framings allows. They were two aspects of the same person, produced by the same origins and the same experiences and the same specific combination of gifts and damage that were never quite integrated into a single coherent self, and that the career and the fame and the alcohol had no particular interest in integrating. Come with me. We are going back to the beginning, which is not Hollywood but Tasmania, in the year 1909, to a family that was educated and ambitious and that produced, in its eldest son, a combination of intellectual restlessness and physical vitality, and the specific quality of charm that is indistinguishable, in the early years, from simple goodness, and that only reveals its more complicated nature when the circumstances that test it arrive. Errol Leslie Thompson Flynn was born on the 20th of June, 1909, in Hobart, Tasmania, to Professor Theodore Thompson Flynn, a distinguished marine biologist, and Lily Mary Young Flynn, a woman of English descent who had the specific quality of vivid, dramatic beauty that the subsequent photographs confirm was transmitted to her son in full. His father was a serious man, serious in the way of academics who are committed to their work with a completeness that does not leave much residual attention for the domestic dimensions of a life that the academic work shares space with. He was present in the family in the physical sense and somewhat absent in the emotional sense. In the specific way of men of his generation and his professional class, who understood their function as provision and intellectual modeling, rather than the warmer forms of engagement. He loved his son, by every account, but The love was expressed in the expectation of achievement rather than in the unconditional warmth of a man who has decided that the child's existence is sufficient justification for the warmth. His mother was a different problem. Lily Flynn was a woman of considerable energy and considerable self-involvement, who was not, by the consistent testimony of people who knew the family, organized primarily around the needs of her children. She was social, she was attractive, she was interested in the world she occupied in ways that the world of a marine biologist's wife, in Hobart, Tasmania, was not always adequate to satisfy. And the satisfaction of the dissatisfaction took forms that did not always prioritize the children. Errol Flynn grew up in a household where both parents were present and neither was fully available, which is one of the specific configurations of childhood that produces, in the children who experience it, a quality of compulsive engagement with the world outside the household, a turning outward toward whatever the exterior world offers in the way of the warmth and the attention and the specific quality of being fully seen that the interior world is not providing. He was expelled from school, multiple schools. The expulsions were not for academic failure. He was intelligent enough that the academic requirements did not present the difficulty that would have been the ordinary cause. They were for behavior that the schools found unacceptable, which was behavior that a subsequent reading of his psychology would interpret as the behavior of a boy who is seeking, through the disruption of institutional authority, the attention and the response that the domestic environment has not provided in adequate quantities. He left Australia. He went to New Guinea, which was in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the specific kind of destination that young men with his combination of physical capability and restless intelligence and inadequate supervision chose when they needed to be somewhere that was large enough and lawless enough to contain what they were. He worked on a plantation. He worked as a labor recruiter, which, in the context of New Guinea in 1930, was a profession whose ethical dimensions were not entirely straightforward. He had experiences that the subsequent memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, published the year he died, described with the combination of relish and self-awareness that characterized everything he wrote. He had a gift for writing. This is the fact about Errol Flynn, that the mythology of the adventurer and the swashbuckler has most completely obscured. And it is a fact worth establishing clearly because it changes the way you understand everything else about him. He wrote. He wrote well. He wrote with a quality of observation and irony, and the specific kind of humor that requires genuine intelligence to produce. The humor of a man who is paying attention to what is happening and finding in it the absurdity that most people miss. He published a novel. He wrote journalism. He wrote the memoir, which is one of the more remarkable autobiographies in the history of Hollywood, not because it is entirely truthful. It is not, and he would have been the first to acknowledge that it is not, but because it is genuinely written, in a way that the celebrity memoirs of his era were not usually genuinely written. He arrived in England in the early 1930s, after New Guinea and a period in Australia, and he appeared in a small film. The film was seen by someone at Warner Brothers. The someone at Warner Brothers understood from the footage that what they were looking at was the specific combination of physical presence and natural ease in front of a camera that the studio system had spent its entire existence trying to find and had rarely found in quite this form. He was brought to Hollywood in 1935. He was 25 years old. He had been in a jungle and on a plantation and in various forms of trouble. And he had written a novel, and he had the face that God had given him, which was the face that the camera fell in love with immediately and entirely, and which produced in audiences the specific response that no amount of studio management can manufacture without the original raw material. Captain Blood in 1935 was the first film, and the first film was all the industry needed to understand what it had. He played Peter Blood, the Irish physician sold into slavery, who becomes a pirate, who becomes a hero, and the role required from him, the combination of physical action and charm, and the specific quality of romantic energy that the swashbuckler genre demands from its protagonist, and that Errol Flynn provided with the naturalness of someone who is not performing the qualities, but simply has them. The audience's response was the response of people who had found the thing they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. The fan mail arrived in quantities that the studio's mailroom was not prepared for. The subsequent films, The Charge of the Light Brigade in 1936, The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938, The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex in 1939, The Seahawk in 1940, built the specific mythology of Errol Flynn that the subsequent decades would consume, and that the subsequent decades would also, when the mythology required revision, revise. He was, across those films, genuinely extraordinary. Not in the way of actors whose work repays the kind of close analytical attention that serious criticism brings. The swashbuckler is not the genre in which the close analytical attention is most productively applied, because the genre's purposes are not primarily the purposes that close analysis serves. He was extraordinary in the way of performers whose qualities are exactly what the form they are working in requires, and whose meeting of the form's requirements is so complete that the meeting itself becomes a kind of art. He moved with a quality that the camera had not found in that precise configuration before him. The physicality was genuine. He was actually athletic, actually capable of the movement that the films required, actually trained in the fencing and the riding and the physical vocabulary of the adventure genre, rather than performed by a man who is pretending to be capable of those things. The charm was genuine. The ease was genuine, in the sense that it was not manufactured, but was the natural expression of a person for whom the performance of ease was not a departure from who he was, but a direct expression of one of the things he actually was. What was not quite genuine, or rather, what was genuine but complicated, was the specific quality of the image that the films and the studio built around what was genuine in him. The image was Errol Flynn as a figure of uncomplicated heroism, of the good man who wins through courage and charm, of the person whose moral virtue is as evident as his physical capability. The image was attractive and commercially powerful, and it was, as a complete account of the person it was attached to, significantly incomplete. The incompleteness was not a studio invention. The studio worked with what it had, and what it had was a person who was complicated in ways that complicated people are complicated, which is to say in ways that include things that are genuinely admirable and things that are genuinely not. The studio's contribution to the image was not the manufacture of qualities that Errol Flynn did not have, but the selective emphasis of the qualities that served the image and the selective management of the qualities that did not. He drank. He had been drinking since before Hollywood, since New Guinea, since the period in Australia, in the way of a person for whom alcohol is not a social habit, but a daily condition, not consistently impairing, not in the early years, but present in a way that organized the days around its presence. He drank on set, which the directors learned to manage, and which the studio learned to manage, and which became, over the years, one of the things about Errol Flynn that the people who worked with him factored into their planning in the way that you factor a weather condition into plans that require the weather to cooperate. He was unfaithful in his marriages with the systematic consistency of a man who has never developed the specific capacity for exclusive sexual fidelity, and who has also never developed the specific capacity for the pretense of exclusive sexual fidelity that the marriages of public figures in that era were expected to maintain. He married 3 times. He was unfaithful in all 3 marriages, with a frequency and a disregard for concealment that made the infidelity a running public narrative in the entertainment press of the era, and that the studios managed as best they could, which was not always well. He had a pattern of relationships with very young women that was, by the standards of subsequent decades, more than simply the romantic preference of a man who was attracted to youth. The pattern was present throughout his career and was the source, in 1942 and 1943, of the criminal trial that was the most significant public event of his professional life. The trial. Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley were the two accusers. Hansen was 17. Satterley was 15. The alleged events had occurred in 1941 and early 1942. The criminal charges were statutory rape, which in California in 1942 meant that the question of consent was legally irrelevant. The age of the accusers made the acts criminal regardless of consent, and the factual question was whether the acts had occurred. The trial was a spectacle of the specific kind that celebrity criminal trials in mid-century America produced. Daily coverage in the newspapers, the courtroom crowded with observers, the testimony reported in detail that was graphic by the standards of the time, and that the newspaper editors published because the public appetite for the graphic testimony of a famous man's trial was commercially irresistible. Flynn's attorney was Jerry Giesler, who was one of the most skilled criminal defense lawyers in Los Angeles in the 1940s, and who understood that the defense of Errol Flynn required not only the management of the legal questions, but the management of the public's emotional relationship to the defendant. Giesler understood that the public loved Errol Flynn, that the audience for the Swashbuckler films had an investment in the person who made them that was personal rather than simply commercial, and that the management of that love was the foundation on which the legal defense could most effectively build. The jury acquitted him on all counts. The acquittal produced a specific new public narrative about Errol Flynn, which was the narrative of the unjustly accused innocent man vindicated by the system. This narrative was received by the public with the relief of people who had invested in the image and who found the acquittal sufficient justification for continuing the investment. What the acquittal did not resolve was the underlying question, not the legal question, which the jury had resolved, but the human question about what the pattern of his behavior with very young women represented and what should be made of it. That question was not resolved by the jury. It was not resolved by the studio. It was not resolved by the public, which received the acquittal as resolution and did not require anything further. The subsequent decades have returned to it, with the specific moral seriousness that subsequent decades bring to the behavior of earlier eras. And the returning has produced assessments that range across a wide spectrum. I am not going to give you my assessment because my assessment of the moral weight of his behavior with those women is not what this story requires from me and is not something that the evidence, as I understand it, allows me to provide with the certainty that a definitive assessment requires. What I will tell you is that the behavior was real, that it was a pattern and not an isolated incident, and that the acquittal resolved the legal question without resolving the human one. He continued to work after the trial. The career did not end, as the studio had feared it might, because the public's love for the image was more resilient than the studio had expected. He made films through the 1940s and into the 1950s, with diminishing commercial returns as the specific form of swashbuckling heroism that he represented fell out of fashion, and as the drinking and the accumulated physical cost of the life he had been living produced in the person who appeared on screen in those years something that was visibly different from the person who had appeared in Captain Blood in 1935. He aged badly in the specific way of people for whom the physical beauty has been the primary commercial asset and who find, when the beauty changes, in the ways that alcohol and excess and the accumulation of hard living change it, that the commercial value changes with it at a rate that is faster than the rate of change in someone whose commercial value is not so specifically dependent on the physical. He was aware of it. He was not the kind of person who was unaware of the things that were happening to him. He was too intelligent for unawareness, too given to the specific clear-eyed self-observation that produced the memoir, which is as honest about his decline as it is about his peak, in the way of someone who has decided that the honesty is more interesting than the management. He had been making films in Europe and in low-budget American productions through the late 1950s, in the specific professional category of work that represents the career in its declining phase, when the opportunity arose in 1958 for the film that would become the last genuinely significant work of his career. The Roots of Heaven, directed by John Huston, was a film about the conservation of African elephants, a subject that had not previously been the subject of a major Hollywood production. And that attracted Errol Flynn partly because the subject was genuinely one he cared about, and partly because John Huston was the director. And working with John Huston was something that most serious actors of the period would have reorganized their professional circumstances to be able to do. The film was made under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. The African location was genuinely remote. The heat was extreme. The logistics were demanding in ways that the films made in the studio system had not prepared the cast and crew for. And Errol Flynn was, by the accounts of multiple people who were present for the filming, not in good physical condition, drinking heavily, visibly unwell in ways that went beyond the ordinary deterioration that the previous decade had produced. Huston, who was not a man given to excessive tenderness about the difficulties of the people who worked for him, has described in his memoir the specific experience of directing Errol Flynn on the African location. And the description is the description of a man who was watching someone in the late stages of a process that the person was aware of and was continuing through anyway, with the specific quality of professional commitment that survived the physical deterioration. He completed the film. The film was released and received with something less than the enthusiasm that its makers had hoped for, though the subsequent decades have been kinder to it than the initial reception was. He went to Vancouver, Canada in October of 1959 to complete the sale of his yacht, the Zaka, which he was selling because the money had run out, as the money tends to run out when it is being spent at the rate it was being spent. He was 50 years old. He arrived in Vancouver in the company of his girlfriend, Beverly Hills, who was 17 years old. He died on October the 14th, 1959. He was 50 years old. The cause of death was a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The autopsy found evidence of significant cardiovascular disease and the specific physical deterioration of a man whose body had been absorbing the consequences of the life it had been required to live for 30 years. The pathologist who performed the autopsy is reported to have said that the body he was examining was the body of a man of 75, not 50. He had lived 50 years in 30. The two men that October evening in 1942, the man in the courtroom and the man at the dinner table, were the same person at different registers of the same truth. The man in the courtroom was the man who had done the things that the grand jury was convening about, who had the pattern of behavior with young women that the trial would expose and that the acquittal would not resolve. The man at the dinner table was the man who was funny and warm and full of stories and who made people feel, for the duration of his company, like the most interesting people in the room. Both were real. Both were him. And the 50 years of his life, the Tasmania childhood and the New Guinea years and the Hollywood peak and the trial and the decline and the Vancouver hotel room, did not produce an account of which of the two men was the true one. They produced instead the account of a person in whom both were present simultaneously, in the way that people who have been damaged early contain both the damage and the genuine qualities that coexist with it without canceling each other. He was a brilliant screen presence who gave audiences 2 decades of genuine pleasure. He was a person whose behavior with young women was a pattern that the jury acquittal did not excuse and that the public mythology did not adequately account for. He was a man of genuine intelligence and genuine wit and genuine literary ability who used all of it across 50 years to be the most charming man in any room he entered, and to manage, from behind that charm, the specific damage of the interior life that the charm was designed to present as something other than damage. He was two men. America knew one of them. The other one was there the whole time. Now, I want to sit with you for a moment, my friend, in the specific kind of reflection that a story like this one requires. Because Errol Flynn is the kind of figure who invites the simple response, the simple condemnation or the simple celebration, and who resists the simple response when you look at him carefully enough. He was not a good man in the simple sense. The behavior was real. The damage the behavior caused to the young women who were its objects was real. The pattern was not an aberration, but a consistent feature of who he was, and the comfortable framing of the trial as an injustice done to an innocent man is not a framing that the available evidence fully supports. He was also not a bad man in the simple sense, if by bad man we mean a person who was entirely without the genuine qualities that genuine engagement with other people requires. The charm was not only a tool of manipulation, the warmth was not only a performance, the intelligence was real, and the humor was real, and the generosity, he was, by the accounts of people who knew him in private rather than in public, genuinely generous with money and time and attention in the specific way of people who actually care about the people around them. The complexity is the truth of him. The complexity is also, as I said at the beginning, more human than the simple story in either direction allows, because most people contain both the genuine qualities and the damaging ones. And the question of what to make of a person who contains both is not a question with a clean answer. And Errol Flynn is an extreme case of a truth that is not, in its structure, extreme at all. He died at 50 in a Vancouver hotel room. He was selling his yacht because the money was gone. His girlfriend was 17 years old. He was 50 years old, and he had lived, in the specific biological sense, of what 50 years of that life had done to his body. More like 75. He had been two men his whole life. He died as one of them. Which one, my friend, depends on which evening you were at. Sleep well. And the next time you see him on screen, the leap, the grin, the specific quality of effortless, photogenic joy that the camera found in him, and that no amount of biographical revision can make less real, see both. See the man America fell in love with, and see the man America never saw. He was always both. He died both. He left us with the question of what to do with both. And that question, 40 years after Vancouver, does not have a clean answer, which may be the most honest thing about him.